It's time for Tales and Cocktails. Now, last Saturday, Barry Humphries died. Now, he's best known to us for his creation of Dame Edna. He first of all, let me say her last name is Everidge, and that Everidge is the Australian pronunciation for average. So he first created Norm Everidge. But a little later, he created Norm's wife, Edna, and in time, Edna took over. And in time, Edna became a dame. And there's a wonderful clip, or a fun clip on YouTube. Just write in Dame Edna, Charles, and Camilla. Barry was known for various creations, but Edna was his lasting and the most famous. But this first piece that I'm reading tonight, I'll get it together, hold on, is entitled Encounter with Lord Snowden, and it's by Barry Humphries. One evening after work, Stanley Myers and his girlfriend and Rosalind and I dined at a smart new restaurant in Holland Park called Chez Moi. The evening was going very well until Stanley suggested that it might be amusing if I did the trouser trick. This was a simple and perhaps juvenile stunt, which worked only in a dignified or pretentious ambience. All that happened was that my pants fell down, apparently by accident, at a conspicuous moment. The trick was that I should exhibit a high degree of embarrassment. That night, on my way back from the gents, I timed it to perfection. Barely a diner in that crowded restaurant could have missed it. And with a tremendous show of shame and apology and much bowing and shrugging, I retreated to our table, where Stanley, at least, sat convulsed with laughter. Soon the maitre d' was at our side, his lips to my ear. "I am sorry, sir, but we must ask you please to leave the restaurant immediately. Lord Snowden over there is most offended by what's just happened." I had no time to protest, or even to get a view of Princess Margaret's outraged husband. Two burly waiters lifted me bodily from my chair and propelled me out the door into Addison Road, where I was obliged to loiter, undined and unwind. All I had to nibble were a few stale sponge fingers left over from my luncheon zabaglione at Bertorelli's, the kind which are sometimes known rather suggestively as boudoir fingers. I attempted to get back into the restaurant, but the door was locked, and through a chink in a curtain I could see my wife and my friends enjoying a delicious meal as if nothing had happened. Relieved, no doubt, that I was out of the way. On the corner of Addison Road was a telephone box, and after consulting a dog-eared directory, I dialed the number of the restaurant. The maitre d's voice answered, "Hello, hello." I assumed the fluting tones of a middle-aged, upper-class Englishwoman. "This is the Countess of Ross speaking. My son, Lord Snowden, is dining in your restaurant tonight. May I speak with him urgently, please?" There was a long pause on the line, and then a man's voice, "Mother, how did you track me down here?" "Tony, darling," I trilled, "there is a lovely and talented man in your restaurant tonight who has been far from well. His name is Barry Humphries, and he has been accidentally locked out in the street. Please buy him and his party a large bottle of champagne and get the management to apologize." On the other end of the line, I could hear a voice cry, "What, Mother? Who is this? Who is this speaking?" I rang off. The door of Chez Moi, much to my chagrin, was not immediately thrown open until Rosalind, Stanley, and Yvonne at last emerged. But there was a sequel to this sorry incident, which will be told later. Barry Humphries had a show called Housewife Superstar, which had its first performance at the Apollo Theatre in London on the 16th of March, 1976. After the show had been running in the West End for several weeks, Vogue magazine, I was told, wished to interview me, and they were sending a photographer to meet me at the theatre. When I turned up, as usual, slightly late to the appointment, I was considerably taken aback to see that the photographer was already waiting at the stage door. It was Lord Snowden. Remembering a distant and acutely embarrassing incident, I effusively apologized for my lateness, but he was exquisitely polite. He didn't mind in the least, he said, because it gave him a chance to think about the pictures he was planning to take. I'd like to take up most of your day on this job, if you can spare the time, he said. Perhaps we could break somewhere for lunch? I told him I knew a good Italian restaurant near the theatre and would be delighted if he would be my guest. Oh, no, thank you, replied Lord Snowden. I want you to be my guest. There's an excellent French restaurant I know in Addison Road, Holland Park, called Chez Moi. I wonder if you know it. He gave me a broad Royal Doulton smile, and I think he might even have winked. Otherwise, no subsequent reference was ever made to that evening so long ago, when for 2 minutes I had been his mother. Barry Humphries. And for no reason at all, NC, except it's been on my mind lately. The Second World War. I remember vividly my father sending me to get the paper, to bring in the paper. And I did, and I remember the headline, Japanese Bomb Pearl Harbor. So much of my childhood was the war. And this is not a nasty one about the war. This is a funny one by Peter Ustinov. And it's entitled The Invasion of Maidstone, 1941. Our next duty was to try and capture the town of Maidstone from the Home Guard, that civilian task force of veterans and the infirm, who was supposed to harass the Germans in case of a landing and hold vital positions until better armed units of the army could be deployed. We were, on this occasion, supposed to be German. As soon as the battle began, I detached myself from my unit and advanced alone to the center of the town by the simple expedient of knocking on people's doors. When they were opened, invariably by men in pajamas or women in night dresses, for it was a little before 6 in the morning, I would explain the vital nature of the maneuver without ever revealing which side I was on. Flushed with patriotism, the good burghers of Maidstone forgot their annoyance at being awoken so early and let me through their houses and into their gardens. Here I would climb into a neighboring garden and knock on the back door of another house. These people would then let me out of their front doors. Looking both ways, I would then race across the road and knock at another front door, and the process would repeat itself. It took me over 2 hours to penetrate into the center of the city at right angles, as it were, to the traffic. There I suddenly found myself before the Home Guard headquarters. A choleric general emerged. I aimed my rifle at him and fired. Since the rifle was empty, it only produced a click, which neither he nor the umpire, a very stout lieutenant, heard. I consequently shouted, "Bang!" and then informed the general politely that he was dead. Death was the farthest thing from the general's mind, and he spluttered, "Don't talk such tommy rot. Who are you, anyway?" The umpire turned out to have a terrifying stammer. His face scarlet with effort and apology, he told the general that he was indeed, but the word simply would not come. It was the delay in the verdict which more than anything seemed to enrage the general. "Look here," he snorted, "it's not good enough. Fellow points a gun at me and says bang. Maybe a bad shot, for all I know. Might have come out of the encounter unscathed, what? Would you have preferred me to use ammunition? I asked. The general lost his head. Who asked your advice? He blustered. Haven't you done enough harm? Dead, the umpire managed at length. I won't accept it. Won't accept it, do you hear? Not from a mere lieutenant. It was the lieutenant's turn to be annoyed. I am I don't give a damn about all that, ranted the general. I'm off to inspect the forward positions, and I'd like to see the chap who's going to stop me. Sie sind tot, I cried. The general spun on me, suspicious for the first time. What did you say? Sie sind tot, Herr General. Are you talking some foreign language or something? Asked the general, as though he was on the trail of something big. Ich bin Deutscher. German, eh? The general asked, his eyes narrowing. Accredited umpire of this, the lieutenant declared. Just then some other home guards appeared out of headquarters. I've caught a German prisoner, cried the general. Put him under lock and key. And then, brushing the umpire aside, he jumped into his staff car and told the driver to leave the scene of his humiliation as quickly as possible. The umpire was boiling with frustration. So, he hissed. So am I, sir, I said as I was led away. A Home Guard major read all my correspondence, culled from my pockets, and then began a cross-examination. I refused to answer in any language but German. The major became very irritated. Now look here. I'm going to report you to your unit if you don't pull up your socks and answer a few questions. Das ist mir egal, I rasped. That's your final word? He asked evilly. Heil Hitler, I shouted. That does it. They chose to lock me in the armory. I seized a Sten gun, broke open the door, upset the staff table, smeared ink on the maps and plans of the local high command before I was overpowered by a cohort of old gentlemen to whom I wished no harm, and therefore allowed myself to be locked into a disused scullery. They were all very angry indeed, and I felt that the frontier between fact and fiction had become unclear. One or two of them looked at me as though indeed I were a Nazi. In the mid-afternoon, the colonel of my battalion arrived. He was a man whose voice rarely rose above a whisper, and whose head emerged from the front of his uniform at such an extravagant angle that from the side one could read the name of his tailor inside the jacket. He had the curious prehistoric look of a bemused turtle, and I always felt that if we ever had to face actual warfare in the company of this gentleman, he might well, in a moment of difficulty, disappear into his uniform until the storm blew over. Now what's all this? He asked me almost inaudibly. I explained, as so often, my version of the truth. I see, he murmured. But was it really necessary to confuse the issue by speaking in German? It's a manner in which the Germans are likely to confuse the issue, sir, if they should ever land in Maidstone, I suggested. See what you mean, he said, although that's an eventuality I consider to be most unlikely, don't you? I was a little surprised to be consulted, but decided to suggest that if there was no likelihood of the Germans landing in Maidstone, we were all wasting our time. Quite, he agreed absently, then smiled briefly. Full marks. On his way out, he hesitated a moment. You are one of my men, aren't you? I'm wearing the uniform, sir, I pointed out. Yes. I just thought you might belong to the Home Guard. But then, of course, there'd be absolutely no point in your talking German. Muttering confirmations of his own opinion, he left the room and secured my release by suggesting the Home Guard should all learn German in order to know how to deal with recalcitrant prisoners if, of course, the Germans ever had the bad taste to come to Maidstone. And that is by Peter Ustinov. Yeah, The Invasion of Maidstone, 1941. This next is by John Colville, and it's called Flying Visit. Excuse me. This was the name of an ingenious and entertaining fantasy published by Peter Fleming early in the Second World War. In it, Hitler made an inadvertent forced landing in Britain, and the story retailed the embarrassment to which this event gave rise. I read it early in 1940 and forgot about it. The Great Blitz struck London in September. Night after night, the air raid sirens moaned their warning as darkness fell, and night after night, up to 1,000 Londoners died. The last and perhaps the heaviest raid took place on 10/11, May 1941, and thereafter, because the Nazis had other preoccupations, there was peace in the skies over Britain until sporadic attacks began again in the early months of 1944, followed shortly afterwards by the final assault of the V-bombs. On 10 May, I was alone at 10 Downing Street. One of my colleagues had gone with the Prime Minister to Ditchley, since the moon was full and at such times Chequers was believed to be vulnerable. The other two were profiting from a much-needed weekend off duty. It was a warm, early summer's evening, and there was no immediate crisis, but the air raid sirens sounded, and I went to bed in a bunk in the somewhat rickety shelter which had been hastily constructed near the kitchen just before war broke out, and which was certainly not bomb-proof. The bombs fell, several on the Horse Guards Parade, and one in Whitehall. For some inexplicable reason, I awoke a few seconds before each explosion, all of them shaking the house and the shelter in which I slept. Tired, and by this time hardened to air raids, I invariably fell asleep again immediately. Before 6 a.m., the noise of bombs and anti-aircraft fire slackened. As I lay half awake in my uncomfortable bunk and the fetid, badly air-conditioned atmosphere, my dozing thoughts turned to Peter Fleming's book. I remembered, too, the report I had seen in an Air Ministry Intelligence Digest that Goering was believed to fly over from time to time in a German bomber in order to gloat over the destruction which the Luftwaffe was wreaking on London. What fun it would be if he had to escape from a burning bomber by parachute. My half-waking daydreams ambled on, and always they kept returning to Peter Fleming's book. At 7:30 on that Sunday morning, I dressed and went out. It was, or should have been, a perfect May morning, but a low cloud of smoke hung over the town, and because a warehouse full of paper had been among the night's casualties, small flakes of paper were falling from heaven for all the world as if it were snowing. The House of Commons was a ruin. Flames were bursting from the roof, William Rufus's roof, of Westminster Hall, and Westminster Abbey had received its only direct hit of the war. The Horse Guards Parade was pitted with craters. Water from a ruptured main was pouring in a torrent down Whitehall. Why 10 and 11 Downing Street, fragile remnants of Sir George Downing's 17th century jury building, had not collapsed like a pack of cards, I do not know. I went to a service in St. Faith's Chapel, crowded by those who, like myself, wanted to thank God for their survival through such a night. Back at number 10, I rang up Ditchley, spoke to the Prime Minister, and described the scene. At least, he said, we shot down 33 of the swine. Well, he had been talking to the Air Ministry. The cloud of smoke evaporated. The fire engines and the ambulances proceeded with their familiar daily duties. Life returned to wartime London blitz, normal. At about 11 o'clock, I walked over to the Foreign Office. There might perhaps be some news, and anyhow it would be pleasant to gossip with Nicholas Lawford, an amusing and stimulating private secretary to Anthony Eden, whom I knew to be on duty there. When I opened the door of the large private secretary's room, adjacent to that of the Secretary of State, Lawford was talking on the telephone. He saw me and said to the other party, "Here is the man you'd better speak to. Hold on a minute." Then, placing his hand over the receiver, he whispered to me, "This may be a lunatic. He says he is the Duke of Hamilton, that something extraordinary has happened, that he is about to fly down from Scotland to Northolt, and that he wants to be met there by Alex Cadogan and the Prime Minister's secretary. Alec is having his first day off for months, and I refuse to ruin it. And he won't say what it is all about, except that it is like an E. Phillips Oppenheim thriller. Yes, I think he's a lunatic." He handed me the receiver, and the alleged Duke repeated his message. Suddenly, my waking daydream came back to me. "Has somebody arrived?" I asked. There was a long pause. "Yes," he said. "Please be at Northolt to meet me." He rang off. I could scarcely leave number 10 unmanned, and so I rang up Ditchley and asked for instruction. "Well, who has arrived?" asked the Prime Minister. "I don't know," I repeated for about the fourth time. He wouldn't say. "It can't be Hitler." "I imagine not." "Well, stop imagining and have the Duke, if it is the Duke, sent straight here from Northolt." Thus it was that later that day, Churchill learned from the Duke of Hamilton, who turned out to be neither an impostor nor a lunatic, that Rudolf Hess had arrived in Scotland. As for me, I make no pretense to psychic powers, but I think it strange that Peter Fleming's story, which I had read many months before and had long since forgotten, should have come flooding into my half-conscious brain that Sunday morning. John Colville. I remember indeed the excitement and wondering why Rudolf Hess, and he did it all on his own. He was not representing Germany in any way. He came to Scotland all on his own, and the effect was enormous. Oh, indeed. Well, I think that's it. Yes, that is it. All right, my dears, that's a bit of a potpourri. And next week I'll give you a much longer one. But I'm a little under the weather still, so we'll hold it right there. Good night. Thank you for being with me. I'll see you next week for Tales and Cocktails.